The war chamber of the Alpha was never meant to feel like a place of fear, because fear was supposed to belong to everyone else. Yet on this night, fear had weight, texture, and a sound of its own as it pressed against the stone walls and settled into the throats of every warrior standing in formation. The air was heavy with burnt cedar and iron oil from the torches that lined the hall, flickering like restless eyes that refused to blink. At the center of the chamber stood the Alpha's war table carved from ancient blackwood, surrounded by commanders whose reputations alone had silenced entire territories. And yet, none of them were speaking. Not because they were waiting for orders, but because something had already interrupted everything they thought they understood about power. The doors at the far end of the chamber were still swinging slightly from the force with which they had been opened, and through them walked the Omega. No announcement, no escort, no hesitation. Just her footsteps cutting cleanly through the silence like something that did not belong in the world they had built. Every head turned at once, not out of curiosity but instinctive alarm, because Omegas were not supposed to walk into this room without being dragged, summoned, or broken first. She stopped only when she reached the edge of the war table close enough for every council member to see her face clearly. And that was when the first shift happened in the room. Not sound, not movement, but recognition of something wrong. The Alpha did not stand immediately. He remained seated at the head of the table, the fingers resting loosely against the carved edge as if he had been interrupted during something trivial rather than the most secure council gathering in the region. His eyes lifted slowly toward her, and for a brief moment there was nothing in his expression at all. No rage, no curiosity, just an unsettling blankness as though his mind had not yet decided what category she belonged to anymore. Then he laughed. It was not loud, not theatrical, but soft enough to make the silence sharper. A sound that did not match the situation, like a blade sliding against glass. That laugh alone made two of the commanders shift their weight instinctively. The Alpha tilted his head slightly as if studying a memory that refused to behave and said nothing for a moment longer than comfort allowed, letting the tension stretch until it became almost unbearable. The Omega did not look away. She did not bow. She did not even blink. That was when the Alpha finally spoke, voice calm in a way that felt more dangerous than anger. "You walked back into my territory." The words were not a question. They were an observation layered with disbelief. One of the elders immediately leaned forward, voice sharp, demanding explanation. But the Alpha raised a hand without looking at him, and the entire chamber obeyed instantly. The Omega finally spoke, her voice steady but carrying something underneath it that made even the torches feel colder. "It was never yours to begin with." That single sentence cracked something invisible in the room. A few warriors tightened their grip on their weapons without realizing it. The Alpha's gaze sharpened slightly, as though she had just said something that did not match the version of her he had stored in his memory. Slowly, he stood. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, but it changed the geometry of the room. Power always did. When he stepped away from the chair, the space behind him felt emptier, as if even authority needed time to adjust. He walked around the table until he was only a few steps from her, close enough that most would have instinctively lowered their gaze, but she remained still, her posture unbroken. The Alpha studied her face now with more intention, as though searching for an error in reality. "You were dismissed," he said quietly. "You were sent away because you were nothing." A murmur rippled through the council at that word. Nothing. Because everyone in the room knew what Omegas were supposed to be. Weak. Forgotten. Yet controlled. Disposable. But the Omega's expression did not change. Instead, something in the air around her seemed to tighten, not visibly, but perceptibly, like pressure building before a storm breaks. The Alpha noticed it. His eyes narrowed slightly. That was the first crack in his composure. Behind him, One of the younger commanders whispered under his breath, "She shouldn't be here." But the Omega turned her head slightly toward him without even looking directly at him, and he immediately stopped speaking. Not because she threatened him, but because something about her attention alone felt heavier than command. The Alpha stepped closer again, now only a breath away from her. "Tell me why you are standing in my war chamber," he said, voice lower now, more controlled, as if he was trying to force the situation back into a shape he understood. The Omega finally moved, but only slightly, reaching into the inside of her coat. Instantly, every guard in the room tensed, weapons half raised. But she did not stop. She slowly withdrew a small object wrapped in dark cloth and placed it on the edge of the war table. No sudden movements, no aggression, just certainty. The Alpha's gaze dropped to it. The room felt like it stopped breathing. When she unwrapped it, the object revealed itself to be a fractured seal stone etched with markings that did not belong to any known pack lineage. The moment the Alpha saw it, something flickered across his face too quickly to name. Recognition. Or something dangerously close to it. He reached out but did not touch it immediately. "Where did you get this?" he asked. But his voice had changed slightly, less commanding now, more restrained. The Omega replied, "From beneath your foundation." Silence hit the room again, but this time it was different. Not empty. Heavy with implication. The Alpha's hand finally closed around the stone, and the moment he touched it, the torches in the chamber flickered violently as if reacting to something unseen. A few council members stood abruptly, alarm breaking through their discipline. One of them demanded the Omega be detained immediately, but the Alpha did not move, did not look away from the stone. Instead, he asked a quieter question. "Who sent you back?" The Omega's answer came without delay. "No one sent me. When I came back because you built your empire on something you buried too deep to remember." That was when the atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to fracture, because buried truths always reacted violently when disturbed. The Alpha finally looked at her fully now, not as an Omega, not as an exile, but as something that did not fit any category he had trained himself to recognize. "You don't understand what you are stepping into," he said. And for the first time, there was something almost like warning in his voice, not protection, not concern, calculation wrapped in unease. The Omega leaned slightly closer, just enough that only he could hear her next words clearly. "I understand it better than you do." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the council seemed frozen in place, waiting for permission to exist. The Alpha's jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time since she entered, the slightest uncertainty appeared in his posture. Because something about her was wrong in a way that did not fit logic. Omegas did not stand like that. Omegas did not return like that. Omegas did not make Alphas hesitate. Outside the chamber, distant thunder rolled across the mountains, though the sky had been clear moments before. The Omega turned her head slightly toward the sound, then back to him. "They are already waking," she said quietly. That sentence made no sense to anyone in the room except the Alpha, whose expression changed just enough to confirm that it should have made no sense to him either, and yet it did. A secret buried so deep it should not have survived memory. The Alpha took a step back, breaking proximity for the first time since he approached her. That retreat alone sent a ripple through the room, because Alphas did not step back. Not from Omegas. Not from anything. But he did. The Omega did not follow him. She simply stood at the war table surrounded by enemies who no longer looked entirely sure she was one. And then, as if sealing the moment, she added softly, "You didn't dismiss me. You released something you didn't understand." The Alpha's voice dropped lower, almost dangerously calm. "If that is true, then you just walked into your own execution." The Omega finally allowed the faintest hint of something unreadable to cross her face. Not fear, not defiance, but recognition of a game that had already begun long before either of them entered the room. "No," she said quietly. "I walked into the beginning of yours." For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then the torches surged again, violently this time, as if responding to something no one could see. The Alpha's eyes darkened, and for the first time since she arrived, the war chamber no longer felt like his domain. It felt like a place holding its breath before collapse. And the question now is simple, but dangerous. If you were standing in that chamber, watching someone you once dismissed return with power you cannot explain, would you try to control them? Or would you start questioning everything you were taught about who the real enemy is? The moment the Alpha stopped speaking, the entire war chamber felt like it had been sealed inside something airtight, as though even sound itself was being denied permission to exist freely. The Omega still stood at the edge of the war table, her presence no longer treated as a violation of protocol, but as a variable no one had been trained to calculate. Every commander in the room had seen battles, executions, uprisings, and betrayals, yet none of those experiences prepared them for the stillness that followed her words. The Alpha had stepped back only a fraction, but in a room where authority was measured in inches of dominance, that single retreat had rewritten the hierarchy without permission. No one spoke because no one knew what would survive being spoken. Then, slowly, one of the elder council members broke the silence, his voice strained but still clinging to authority like a man gripping a collapsing rope. He pointed toward the Omega without fully extending his arm, as though even accusation required caution now. "This is not a negotiation chamber," he said sharply. "This is a war council. She should not be standing here at all. We are wasting time debating something that should already be eliminated." A few heads nodded immediately, eager to restore the familiar structure of command, because structure was comfort, and comfort was survival in a world ruled by power. Another commander stepped forward, younger, more impulsive, his hand resting too close to his blade. "We don't even know what she is anymore," he added. "She walked in here without fear. That alone is reason enough to end this." The Omega did not react to either of them. She remained focused on the Alpha, as though the rest of the room had already been categorized as irrelevant noise. That alone unsettled more people than any threat could have. The Alpha did not look at the council immediately. His gaze stayed locked on her, and there was something in it now that had shifted from disbelief to analysis, as if he was no longer trying to identify who she was, but what had changed her. Finally, he spoke again, quieter than before, but carrying more weight. "You were cast out under direct order," he said. "You were declared unfit, unstable, and stripped of all designation. That decision was not made lightly." A pause followed, deliberate, controlled. Then he added, "And yet you are standing here in front of me, unharmed, unbroken, and unafraid." That last word lingered in the air longer than the others. Unafraid. It was not just an observation, it was a contradiction. Omegas were not supposed to return unafraid. They were not supposed to return at all. The Omega finally shifted her attention slightly, just enough to acknowledge the council behind him without truly looking at them. "That is because you misunderstood what you were discarding," she said calmly. The elder council member scoffed immediately. "We discarded weakness," he snapped. "We discarded instability. We discarded something that could not survive within order." The Omega's expression did not change, but something subtle in her posture shifted, like pressure being redirected rather than released. "You did not discard weakness," she replied. "You discarded a truth you were too afraid to study." A faint murmur passed through the chamber. Not agreement, not disagreement, but discomfort. Because discomfort always came when certainty began to crack. The Alpha's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain, he said. The single word cut through the room more effectively than any command. The Omega turned fully now, not away from him, but toward the entire council. For the first time, she was not addressing him alone. You all believe Omegas are born lesser, she said. You believe it is nature, genetics, hierarchy, balance, something inevitable that cannot be questioned. She paused briefly, allowing the weight of that assumption to settle in the room. Then she continued. But what if I told you that nothing about it is natural? That question did not land like curiosity. It landed like intrusion. One of the commanders let out a short, dismissive laugh. That is a dangerous fantasy, he said. We have records spanning generations. The hierarchy is stable because it is proven. The Omega tilted her head slightly. Proven by whom? She asked. No one answered immediately, because that was the problem with systems built on inherited truth. Eventually, no one remembered who validated them first. The Alpha finally moved again, circling the table slowly, not approaching her, but repositioning himself as if trying to see her from a different angle would produce clarity. You are suggesting manipulation of the bloodline structure, he said carefully. That would require access to genetic suppression at a scale that predates even the current ruling packs. The Omega nodded once. Yes, she said simply. It does. That simplicity was more unsettling than any elaborate claim. The elder council member slammed his hand against the table. Enough riddles, he said. If you have evidence, present it. Otherwise, this is madness. The Omega finally reached into her coat again, and this time, no one stopped her. Not because they trusted her, but because they were beginning to realize that stopping her might not matter anymore. She placed a second object on the table. This one was smaller, metallic, and etched with layered markings that did not belong to any single pack dialect. It looked old, but not decayed. Preserved. Intentional. The Alpha stared at it for a moment before reaching for it again. This time he hesitated just slightly before touching it, as if instinct was warning him against contact. When his fingers finally closed around it, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not shock. Recognition again, but deeper now, like a memory resurfacing from a place it was never meant to be retrieved from. This seal, he said slowly, does not belong to any known registry. The Omega responded immediately. It belongs to the original architects of your hierarchy. That sentence altered the temperature of the room more effectively than any physical force. The council shifted uneasily. Even those who had been skeptical now leaned in slightly, because architecture implied design, and design implied intent. The Alpha looked up at her again. Explain your purpose, he said, and this time his voice was no longer purely authoritative. There was something else underneath it now. Caution. The Omega stepped closer to the table, finally entering the space between them fully. I was not sent back here to challenge you, she said. I was sent back to find out if you are still capable of understanding what was done to you. A pause. And whether you are a part of it. That final phrase struck harder than anything before it. Part of it. The council erupted immediately. Voices overlapped. Accusations formed mid-air. Loyalty fractured in real time. One commander shouted that she was a planted weapon from rival territories. Another insisted she was a biological anomaly that should be contained immediately. But the Alpha did not join them. Instead, he raised his hand again, and silence obeyed him instantly. The Omega watched him closely now, because this was the first time he had chosen silence over reaction. You are asking us to question our entire structure, he said finally. That is not a mission, that is collapse. The Omega shook her head slightly. No, she replied. Collapse already happened. You just built a life on top of it and called it stability. That statement hung in the air longer than anything else had. Then, more quietly, she added, "The real question is whether you want to see what is beneath it before it finishes rising." The Alpha's gaze hardened slightly. "And what exactly is rising?" he asked. The Omega did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the room slowly, taking in every face, every weapon, every symbol of authority carved into the walls. Then she said, "Something you were trained to forget." The elder council member stepped forward again, voice shaking slightly now, not with fear of her, but fear of implication. "This is sedition," he said. "You are planting ideas meant to destabilize us." The Omega turned her attention to him for the first time directly. "Ideas do not destabilize truth," she said. "They only expose where truth was already weak." The Alpha finally moved closer to her again, closing distance slowly. Not aggressively, but deliberately, as though trying to reclaim control through proximity. "If what you are saying is real," he said quietly, "then you are not just an exile returning." He paused. "You are evidence." That word changed something again. Evidence implied investigation. Investigation implied vulnerability. The Omega met his gaze without flinching. "That is exactly what I am," she said. A long silence followed, stretching so tightly it felt like it might snap. Somewhere outside the chamber, distant horns sounded, low, rhythmic, not alarm, but signal. The Alpha noticed it immediately. So did she. That was when the hidden purpose beneath everything began to surface without being spoken directly. The Alpha turned slightly toward the sound. "That signal is not ours," he said. The Omega nodded once. "It is not meant to be." Another pause. "It means the system is already responding to my presence." The council froze again, because that meant whatever she was, it was not isolated. It was connected. The Alpha looked back at her, and now his voice was lower than ever before. "You were not dismissed," he said slowly. "You were released into something that was never supposed to wake up." The Omega held his gaze. "And now it has," she replied. For the first time since she entered the chamber, no one argued. No one interrupted. Because every person in that room had begun to realize that the question was no longer whether she belonged there. The question was whether they still belonged anywhere at all. The war chamber did not return to normal after the Omega's words, as because nothing truly returns to normal once certainty has been poisoned at its source. Instead, it settled into something worse than chaos. Controlled unease, the kind that forces people to keep their voices low, not out of respect, but out of fear that speaking too loudly might make the truth respond. The Alpha remained standing near the war table, the fractured seal still resting between his fingers, though he no longer looked at it directly. His attention was now divided between the object, the Omega, and the subtle fracture forming inside the hierarchy he had spent years reinforcing. Around him, the council attempted to regain composure, but it was obvious even to the least perceptive among them that control had already begun to slip in ways no formal command could repair. Then the doors to the chamber opened again, not violently this time, not dramatically, but with quiet precision, as if whoever was entering believed they already owned the right to interrupt whatever was happening inside. No guards announced him. No one challenged him. The reason became clear almost immediately, because the atmosphere itself reacted before the room did. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Shoulders straightened instinctively. Even the Alpha's posture shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, but undeniable to anyone trained to read power dynamics. The man who entered did not need introduction. He was not younger than the Alpha, yet he carried no visible sign of aging either, as if time had learned to avoid marking him too deeply. His presence was not loud, but it occupied space in a way that forced attention without requesting it. He wore no ceremonial armor, No symbolic insignia of rank, and yet every detail of his movement suggested authority that did not require decoration. He stopped just inside the chamber, letting the silence adjust itself around him before taking another step forward. The council did not speak his name, but their reactions did it for them. Subtle tension in the shoulders. Eyes lowered just slightly. Breath held too long. The Omega observed this carefully, noting not fear exactly, but something more complicated: conditioned recognition. The Alpha turned slowly toward him, and for the first time since the Omega had entered, the Alpha's expression shifted into something more controlled than curiosity. It was restraint. "You were not summoned," the Alpha said quietly. The man tilted his head slightly, as if the idea of being summoned or not summoned was irrelevant to him. "I was not required to be summoned," he replied. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was a precision in it that made every word feel intentional. The council leader stepped forward cautiously. "High Strategist Kale," he said, voice carefully neutral. "This is an internal war chamber session. Your presence was not authorized." Kale turned his attention to him briefly, and the council leader immediately stopped speaking mid-sentence, as if the continuation of his own authority had been quietly removed. Kyle did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply said, "Authorization is a concept you still believe applies here?" The question was mild in tone, but devastating in implication. No one answered. Kale continued walking forward, slowly now, circling the outer edge of the chamber rather than approaching the table directly, as if inspecting the structure of the room itself. His eyes moved across the carved war maps, the assembled commanders, the symbolic markers of territory and dominance. It was not admiration in his gaze. It was evaluation. The Omega noticed something important immediately. He was not surprised by her presence. That distinction mattered. Everyone else in the room had reacted to her as an anomaly. He reacted as if she were expected. The Alpha noticed it too. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You knew she would be here," he said. Kyle paused near the far side of the chamber, finally turning his attention fully toward the Alpha. "I knew the probability," he corrected. "There is a difference." The Alpha stepped slightly away from the war table now, placing himself between Kale and the Omega without fully realizing it, a subtle repositioning that did not go unnoticed. "Explain your involvement," the Alpha said. Kale's gaze shifted briefly to the Omega before returning to the Alpha. "My involvement predates your current understanding of involvement," he said. That answer did not clarify anything. It was not meant to. The council murmured uneasily again, but Kale raised a hand slightly, not in command, but in dismissal, and the murmuring stopped anyway. The Omega watched carefully now, because unlike the Alpha's authority, which was enforced through structure, Kale's authority seemed to operate through expectation alone. People did not wait for him to command them. They waited for him to acknowledge whether their existence still applied. The Alpha spoke again, voice sharper now. "You are not here to observe. You are here because something has shifted." Kyle nodded once. "Yes." A pause. "She has returned." The room tightened instantly. Even the council members who had been skeptical earlier now looked between Kale and the Omega with renewed suspicion, because confirmation from him carried more weight than speculation from anyone else. The Alpha turned slightly toward the Omega without breaking attention from Kale. "You recognize her," he said. Kale's expression remained unchanged. "I recognize the category she belongs to," he replied. That phrasing alone caused a ripple of discomfort. The Omega finally spoke. "I don't belong to any category you created," she said evenly. Kale looked at her directly now for the first time since entering fully. His gaze lingered, not analyzing her appearance, but something deeper, like tracing structural integrity beneath visible form. That is not entirely accurate, he said. The Alpha's tone sharpened. Explain. Kale finally stepped closer to the war table, stopping at the opposite side from the Alpha, creating a triangular tension point between himself, the Alpha, and the Omega. You believe she is an anomaly, Kale said. A deviation from expected genetic output, a failure of classification. He paused slightly. That belief is incorrect. The council stiffened. The Alpha's jaw tightened. Then what is she? Kale did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed his hand lightly on the edge of the war table, as if grounding himself in physical reality before speaking. She is a return condition, he said. The phrase meant nothing to most in the room, but to those few who understood structural modeling of pack lineage systems, it meant something deeply unsettling. The Alpha understood immediately. That is not possible, he said quietly. Kale's gaze remained steady. It is not supposed to be possible, he corrected again. The Omega's expression remained controlled, but something in her posture shifted slightly, as if hearing confirmation of something she had already suspected. Kyle continued, voice calm but increasingly precise. When the original hierarchy was established, it was not built as a natural system. It was constructed as a containment model. Omegas were not failures. They were suppressive outputs designed to stabilize aggression variance across dominant lines. The council erupted immediately at that statement, multiple voices overlapping in denial, confusion, and anger. One commander shouted that such a claim was heresy against ancestral doctrine. Another demanded Kale be removed for destabilizing the chamber. But Kale did not react. He simply waited until the noise exhausted itself, and when it did, silence returned, because silence always returned to him. The Alpha's voice cut through it again, lower now. You are saying Omegas were engineered. Kale nodded. Yes. A pause. And periodically, one of them re-emerges outside suppression parameters. The Omega spoke again, quietly. A return condition, she repeated. Kyle looked at her. Yes. The Alpha stepped closer to the table now, tension visible in every controlled movement. Why was this never recorded? He demanded. Kale's answer came without hesitation. Because those who recorded it were the first to be removed from continuity. That statement shifted the entire atmosphere again. Not fear now, but something closer to realization. The Alpha looked at him directly. You are part of the system, he said slowly. Kale did not deny it. I am part of maintenance, he corrected. Not origin. The distinction mattered more than anything else said so far. The Omega's eyes narrowed slightly. Then why am I here now? She asked. Kale turned his attention back to her fully. Because suppression thresholds are failing, he said, and your return indicates the system is no longer stable. The Alpha's voice dropped dangerously low. And what happens when it becomes unstable? Kale looked at him for a long moment before answering. It corrects itself. No one spoke for several seconds after that. Because correction, in systems built on control, rarely meant restoration. The Omega finally asked the question that had been building beneath everything since Kale entered. Who decides what correction means? Kale held her gaze. That depends on who survives the recalibration. The silence that followed was no longer just tension. It was recognition of scale. The Alpha slowly straightened, his authority no longer projecting dominance but resistance against something larger than him. You are not here to warn us, he said. Kyle nodded once. No. A pause. I am here because your system has already begun selecting outcomes. The Omega looked between them now, understanding something deeper forming beneath the surface of their conversation. Kale was not opposing the Alpha, he was describing inevitability. And inevitability did not negotiate, it only progressed. The Alpha finally spoke, voice controlled but altered. And where do I stand in that outcome? Kale looked at him for a long moment before answering. That depends, he said quietly, on whether you still believe you are the one defining it. The implication hung in the air like something already in motion. The Omega understood it fully now. The Alpha was not the center of this structure. Neither was she. Neither was Kale. They were all positions inside something already moving beyond their control. And for the first time since she entered the chamber, the Omega realized the true tension was not between individuals. It was between belief and correction. The chamber did not settle after Kale's words. It simply changed shape in the minds of everyone present, as though reality itself had been subtly rearranged, and no one had been given the instruction manual for the new configuration. The Alpha stood rigid beside the war table, the fractured seal still resting near his hand, though he no longer seemed focused on it. The Omega remained opposite him, her presence now no longer treated as an anomaly, but as an unresolved variable tied directly to something far larger than personal authority or council debate. Kale, however, had shifted the axis of attention in a way neither of them could ignore. He was no longer just an intruder in the chamber. He was now a reference point for everything that had just been said. And that meant the room was no longer dealing with confrontation alone. It was dealing with structure. The council members, still shaken, attempted to regain composure through protocol. One of them insisted that all claims made without archival verification must be dismissed until reviewed by sanctioned record keepers. Another demanded Kale's immediate removal from the chamber until formal investigation could occur. But Kale did not respond to any of them. He simply turned his attention away from the group entirely, as though their attempts to reassert hierarchy were irrelevant background noise. Instead, he walked slowly toward the far side of the war chamber, where the stone architecture became less ceremonial and more functional, where the decorative engravings of lineage faded into plain, older construction that predated the current ruling structure. The Omega noticed this immediately. She followed his movement with her eyes but did not move yet. The Alpha did move, however, though not in full pursuit. Kier, he adjusted his position slightly, tracking Kale's trajectory with careful attention, as though he was trying to determine whether this was a diversion or a calculated escalation. Kale stopped at a section of wall that, at first glance, appeared identical to the rest of the chamber. Stone, darkened by age and torch smoke, carved in the same style as the surrounding architecture. But he stood there longer than necessary, studying it with quiet certainty. Then he spoke without turning around. "This chamber was not built as a meeting space," he said. The council leader frowned. "It is a war chamber," he replied. Kyle shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "That is what it was repurposed as." The Alpha's eyes narrowed. "Explain," he said again, but now the word carried less authority and more demand for precision. Kale finally turned slightly, still facing the wall, but addressing the room. "There is a structure beneath this chamber," he said, "not a foundation in the architectural sense, a containment layer." A murmur rippled through the council again, but weaker this time, because repetition of disbelief was beginning to lose effectiveness against Kale's calm certainty. The Omega stepped forward slightly now, finally breaking her stillness. "You mean there is something under us right now?" she said. Kale nodded once. "Yes." The Alpha's voice sharpened. "That is impossible. This chamber sits on solid ancestral stone. There are no recorded lower structures." Kale finally turned fully toward him. "There are no recorded lower structures because recording them was the first step in making them invisible," he said. The Omega's gaze shifted to the wall he was studying. "What is down there?" she asked. Kale did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the wall and placed his hand against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, a faint line of light traced through the stone beneath his palm, as if responding to a signal that had not been activated in a long time. The Alpha noticed immediately. Step away from that, he said sharply, but Kale did not comply. Instead, he pressed his hand more firmly against the stone, and this time the wall responded. A low mechanical resonance spread through the chamber floor, subtle at first, then growing in layered complexity, like something deep beneath them was recognizing authorization that had not been used in generations. The council members stepped back instinctively. The Omega's expression sharpened. "What did you just activate?" she asked. Kale finally removed his hand. "Access," he said simply. The wall shifted. Not dramatically, not explosively, but with a slow, deliberate reconfiguration of stone panels that had been designed to remain invisible until triggered. A seam appeared, vertical at first, then widening as hidden mechanisms released pressure that had been held in place for an unknown amount of time. Behind it was not empty space. It was a passage. Dark, descending, and clearly not part of the chamber's official structure. A cold draft rose from it, carrying with it something older than the scent of stone and oil in the chamber above. Something that did not belong to the present. The Alpha stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "This is treasonous construction," he said quietly. Kale glanced at him. "No," he replied. "This is original construction." The Omega stepped closer to the opening now, her eyes fixed on the darkness below. "And you knew this was here," she said to Kale. It was not a question. Kale nodded. "Yes." That single confirmation shifted the emotional weight in the room again, but this time more dangerously. Because knowledge withheld is never neutral. It always implies selection. The Alpha turned slightly toward Kale, voice controlled but colder now. "How long?" he said. "Have you known?" Kale did not hesitate. "Long enough to understand what you call your kingdom is a controlled surface layer over a corrective system." The council leader stepped forward again, more desperate now. "This is madness," he said. "There are no corrective systems. There is lineage. There is order. There is hierarchy." Kale looked at him directly. "Those are interface terms," he said, "not structural truths." The Omega finally stepped toward the entrance. The Alpha noticed immediately. "Do not move closer," he said, but she did not stop. She looked down into the passage, then back at Kale. "If this is real," she said quietly, "why reveal it now?" Kale's answer came after a brief pause. "Because the threshold event has already begun." The Alpha's gaze sharpened. "What threshold event?" Kale turned slightly toward him. "The return of a suppressed node," he said, "which is why she is here." The Omega's eyes narrowed. "You are not talking about me as an individual?" she said. Kale shook his head once. "No." A pause. "You are the indicator." That word landed differently than all the others. Indicator implied measurement. Measurement implied system. The Alpha stepped closer now, tension tightening in his voice. "You are saying her presence is a trigger," he said. Kale nodded. "Yes." The Omega looked down into the passage again. "And what happens when the system is triggered?" she asked. Kale did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned and began descending the first step into the hidden structure without waiting for permission or agreement. That alone caused immediate reaction from the council, several voices shouting for him to stop. But the Alpha raised a hand again, and silence returned, though this time it felt more fragile. Kyle stopped on the first landing and looked back up at them. "What happens," he said, "is what was designed to happen when imbalance exceeds containment capacity." The Alpha's voice dropped slightly. "And what is that?" Kyle's gaze moved briefly to the Omega before returning to the Alpha. "Recalibration," he said again, but now the word carried weight that no longer felt theoretical. The Omega finally began descending as well, moving past Kale without hesitation. The Alpha followed after a brief pause, and behind him, reluctantly, the council began to descend in uneven succession, some driven by authority, others by fear, and a few by something closer to curiosity they could not suppress. As they moved deeper, the air changed. The scent of the chamber above faded, replaced by something metallic and faintly electric, like energy that had been trapped too long without release. The walls of the passage were not natural stone. They were structured, layered, inscribed with markings that did not match any known pack language, but followed patterns that suggested data storage rather than decoration. The Omega touched one of the walls briefly as she passed, and it responded with a faint pulse of light that spread outward in branching lines before fading again. "It's alive," one of the council members whispered, though it was unclear whether he meant the structure or the system within it. Kyle continued leading them downward until the passage opened into a vast subterranean chamber that none of them had been prepared for. It was not empty. It was organized. Rows of suspended structures lined the space, each one containing sealed containment units, faintly illuminated, each marked with identifiers that predated current lineage classification systems. The Alpha stopped at the edge of the chamber, staring at what lay before him. "This is," he began, but did not finish the sentence. Kale completed it for him. "The archive layer," he said, "where suppressed outcomes are stored, not erased." The Omega walked forward slowly now, her eyes scanning the structures. "These are people," she said quietly. Kale nodded once. They were. Silence expanded again, deeper than before. The Alpha stepped forward, voice lower now, almost controlled disbelief. "You are telling me our entire system is built above this," he said. Kale corrected him. "Your system is one expression of this." The Omega turned slowly. "And Omegas?" she asked. Kale met her gaze. "Are not failures," he said. "They are residual stabilizers from failed suppression cycles." The realization began forming in layers now, not all at once. The Alpha looked around the chamber again, understanding something he had not been given permission to understand before. "Then what are we standing on?" he asked quietly. Kale's answer came without hesitation. "A correction engine that has been running longer than your recorded history." The Omega's voice softened slightly but sharpened in meaning. "And I am part of it," she said. Kale nodded. "Yes." The Alpha looked between them now, realization shifting into something heavier. "Then this is not a discovery," he said slowly. "This is exposure." Kyle looked at him directly. "Yes." A pause. "And exposure is always followed by response." The chamber seemed to respond to that statement, not physically, but structurally, as faint lights along the containment units began to activate one by one in distant sections, as if acknowledging presence that had not been registered in a long time. The Omega watched it carefully, then said quietly, "Then the system already knows we are here." Kyle nodded once. "Yes." The Alpha exhaled slowly, realizing the implication fully now. "And it will react," he said. Kale's gaze remained steady. "It already is." The subterranean archive chamber did not feel like a place that had been discovered so much as a place that had been remembered too late, as though its existence had always been known at a subconscious level, but carefully buried beneath generations of enforced certainty. The suspended containment units stretched in ordered rows deeper than sight could comfortably track, each one faintly illuminated by a cold internal glow that pulsed at irregular intervals. Like dormant systems slowly reacting to the return of something they had been waiting for, without ever being told what they were waiting for. The Omega stood at the front edge of the chamber now, no longer hesitating, her presence in this space no longer treated as intrusion, but as something closer to confirmation. Kale remained slightly behind her, observing not just the chamber but the reactions of everyone inside it, including the Alpha, who stood rigid near the entrance, his authority visibly strained by the scale of what he was now forced to acknowledge. The council members had spread unevenly across the upper edge of the chamber, some refusing to descend further, others compelled by necessity or fear, but all of them visibly destabilized by the realization that what they had built their identities upon was not foundation, but surface coverage over something far older and far more deliberate. And yet none of that mattered anymore, because the real shift came not from discovery, but from betrayal. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, when one of the council's junior strategists stepped slightly away from the group, as if adjusting position for a better view of the archive structures. No one initially paid attention, because movement in a chamber like this was expected, even necessary for psychological stability. But Kale noticed. The Omega noticed as well. The Alpha noticed last, and that delay mattered. The strategist, a man who had remained mostly silent since entering the underground chamber, slowly reached into his coat, not with urgency but with practiced calm, as though he had rehearsed the motion so many times it no longer required thought. Kale's voice cut through the chamber immediately, low and precise. "Stop." The word was not loud, but it was absolute in its timing. The strategist froze for a fraction of a second, then continued anyway. That was the moment the betrayal became real. The Omega turned fully now, her focus narrowing. The Alpha's posture shifted instantly, recognition of threat overriding analysis. "What are you doing?" the Alpha demanded. The strategist did not answer. Instead, he removed a small cylindrical device from within his coat and activated it with a single press. No explosion followed, no immediate destruction. Instead, a pulse of silent resonance expanded outward through the chamber, passing through stone, metal, and containment units with unsettling ease. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the archive systems reacted. The suspended units flickered in irregular sequence, their internal lights shifting from steady pulses to chaotic patterns, as if something within them had just been accessed remotely. Kale's expression tightened slightly. "You have authorization keys," he said. It was not a question. The strategist finally spoke, voice calm but no longer restrained. "I have continuity clearance," he replied. That phrase changed everything in the chamber, though only a few fully understood why. The Alpha stepped forward sharply. "Explain immediately," he ordered. The strategist turned slightly toward him, and for the first time his expression carried something beyond obedience. It carried alignment. "The system does not require correction," he said. "It requires stabilization." The Omega's eyes narrowed. "Stabilization of what?" she asked. The strategist glanced briefly at her, then at Kale, then back to the Alpha. "Of deviation events," he said. Kale's voice dropped lower. "You are not council tier," he said. "You are embedded protocol." The strategist did not deny it. That silence confirmed everything. The Alpha's expression hardened further. "You are not authorized to access archive control layers," he said. The strategist nodded slightly. "Authorization was never intended to be static," he replied. That was when the second phase of betrayal activated. Without warning, several containment units in the distance emitted synchronized pulses, and the faint hum of dormant systems rose into a structured frequency. The Omega immediately sensed the shift, her attention snapping toward the far end of the chamber. "He didn't just activate access," she said quietly. "He initiated synchronization." Kale's gaze followed hers. "Yes," he confirmed. The Alpha turned sharply. "Synchronization with what?" Kale did not answer immediately, because he was already scanning the chamber's structural feedback patterns, reading something beneath the visible systems. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight. "With surface governance channels," he said. The realization hit the Alpha immediately. "You're linking this system to the pack network," he said. The strategist finally allowed a faint expression of acknowledgement. "Reintegration is required," he said. You are operating under fractured authority structures that are no longer aligned with systemic stability. The Omega took a slow step forward. You're calling this stability, she said, while you activate a system that literally woke up when I arrived. The strategist looked at her more directly now. Your arrival is not the cause, he said. It is the confirmation. Kyle stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between the strategist and the Omega. He is not acting independently, Kyle said quietly. He is executing layered directive protocols. The Alpha's eyes sharpened. From whom? He demanded. Kale did not answer immediately, because the chamber itself began to respond again, this time more aggressively. The containment unit's lights shifted into a synchronized pattern, forming sequences that resembled structured communication rather than random activation. The Omega stepped closer to one of the nearest units, placing her hand against the surface. Instantly, the light inside it stabilized into a readable sequence. It's mapping us, she said. Kyle nodded. Yes. The strategist turned slightly, watching her interact with the system. It is classifying you, he corrected. The Alpha moved closer now, tension building in controlled increments. You are working against this pack, he said to the strategist. The strategist finally met his gaze directly. I am working for continuity, he replied. That distinction was not rhetorical, it was structural. The Alpha understood that immediately. Continuity of what? He asked. The strategist did not hesitate this time. Of dominance equilibrium, he said. A pause. Your hierarchy is unstable. The Omega turned slowly now. Because I exist, she said. The strategist did not deny it. Instead, he said something worse. Because you returned. That difference mattered. The Alpha's voice lowered dangerously. Explain. The strategist raised his hand slightly and the chamber responded again, this time projecting faint visual overlays across the containment units, showing layered data structures that moved in response to the Omega's position. Return events are not anomalies, he said. They are corrective responses triggered by imbalance in suppression cycles. Kale's expression tightened further. You are describing recalibration enforcement, he said. The strategist nodded once. Yes. The Omega's voice sharpened. And enforcement requires what? The strategist looked at her directly now. Removal of destabilizing nodes. Silence fell instantly again, but this time it was different. Not confusion. Recognition of intent. The Alpha stepped forward sharply. You are not authorized to enact removal protocols, he said. The strategist tilted his head slightly. Authorization is being redistributed, he said. That was when the third phase of escalation began. From the upper levels of the chamber, faint movement echoed through the passage they had descended from. Not footsteps of those already present, but additional arrivals. Controlled, synchronized, deliberate. Kyle looked upward immediately. They are not alone, he said quietly. The Omega's eyes followed his. How many? She asked. Kale calculated quickly, reading resonance shifts in the archive structure. Enough, he said. The Alpha's voice hardened. You brought reinforcement, he said to the strategist. The strategist did not respond verbally. Instead, he simply activated another layer of the device in his hand, and the chamber responded again, this time locking several exit pathways with heavy structural seals that descended from above. The Omega stepped back slightly, scanning the environment. We are being contained, she said. Kale corrected her immediately. We are being isolated. The difference mattered. The Alpha turned sharply toward Kale. You knew this was coming, he said. Kale did not deny it. Probability was non-zero, he said. The Alpha's voice rose slightly. That is not an answer. Kyle met his gaze. It is the only honest one. The strategist stepped forward slightly now, and for the first time he addressed all of them equally. The system has identified divergence points, he said. You are within one. The Omega narrowed her eyes. And your solution is what? She asked. The strategist's answer was immediate. Reassignment of control layers. That meant replacement, not negotiation, not correction. Replacement of authority structures entirely. The Alpha finally understood the full scale of betrayal now. You are attempting to overwrite governing hierarchy from within the archive system, he said. The strategist nodded. Yes. A pause. Because governance has already failed to maintain stability thresholds. Kale's voice dropped lower. This is not stabilization, he said. This is preemptive override. The strategist looked at him briefly. Functionally identical, he replied. The Omega took another step forward, her voice steady but now carrying controlled intensity. You are calling removal of people stability, she said. The strategist looked at her directly. I am calling preservation of system stability, he corrected. Individuals are variables. That sentence landed harder than anything before it. The Alpha moved suddenly, closing distance toward the strategist. You are committing treason, he said sharply. The strategist did not move away. Treason is defined by the system being preserved, he replied calmly. A pause. And the system has already changed definition parameters. Kale looked between them now, realizing the true structure of conflict had shifted. This was no longer a disagreement within authority. It was authority itself being redefined in real time by embedded systems that no longer recognized traditional command layers. The Omega understood it too, her expression tightening slightly. This is not a coup, she said quietly. The strategist looked at her. No, he agreed. It is correction enforcement. And as if to confirm his words, the archive chamber responded again, deeper this time, activating dormant sequences that began to reshape the spatial dynamics of the room itself, slowly sealing choices, narrowing options, and forcing convergence toward a single outcome. The Alpha realized then that they were no longer inside a chamber. They were inside a decision system that had already begun choosing for them. The archive chamber did not feel like it was descending into chaos anymore, because chaos implies randomness, and what was unfolding beneath the sealed war chamber was anything but random. It was structured, deliberate, and disturbingly patient, like a system that had been waiting for the exact moment all its variables would finally align into a single irreversible outcome. The containment units along the walls pulsed in synchronized patterns now, their internal lights no longer reacting independently, but following a shared rhythm that grew more precise with every passing second. The strategist stood at the center of that evolving order, his device still active, though it now felt less like a tool and more like a key that had already finished its purpose. The Alpha stood a few steps away from him, posture rigid, eyes locked not just on the strategist but on the chamber itself, as though he was trying to identify the exact moment control had stopped being something he could reclaim. Kale remained slightly behind and to the side, watching everything unfold with the kind of calculated awareness that suggested he had not stopped analyzing since the moment he first touched the hidden wall. And the Omega, now standing at the edge of the illuminated patterns cast by the containment units, looked less like an intruder and more like the focal point of a system finally acknowledging its original input. The strategist spoke first, voice steady, almost calm in a way that no longer felt human in the emotional sense. All variables have converged, he said. Finalization sequence is now available. The Alpha's voice cut through immediately, sharper than before but strained at its edges. End this, he ordered. Whatever system you are running, terminate it now. The strategist turned his head slightly toward him. Termination is not a valid outcome in a closed correction cycle, he replied. That statement alone made the Alpha's jaw tighten, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. Kale finally stepped forward slightly. He is not operating under discretionary authority, Kale said quietly. He is executing system-level enforcement logic. The Omega looked between them, her voice controlled but carrying something deeper now, something closer to realization than defiance. Then this was never about us, she said. Kale shook his head once. No, he said. It has always been about what your existence reveals. The strategist raised his hand slightly, and the chamber responded immediately, the containment units brightening in sequence until they formed a continuous lattice of light across the walls and floor. The pattern was no longer chaotic or interpretive. It was directional, focused. The Alpha stepped forward again, this time toward Kale rather than the strategist. You knew this system existed, he said. Kale did not deny it. Yes, he replied. No, but knowing and activating are not the same operation. The Alpha's voice lowered dangerously. You allowed this to happen. Kale met his gaze. I observed probability convergence, he said. Intervention was not authorized within system constraints. The Omega's eyes narrowed slightly. You are still speaking like you are outside of it, she said. Kale paused briefly. That distinction is no longer valid, he admitted. That was the first honest fracture in his composure. The strategist took a step forward into the illuminated lattice, and as he did, the patterns shifted, recalibrating around his position like a system acknowledging proximity of control authority. The pack hierarchy is now considered unstable, he announced. All governing structures will be reallocated under continuity protocols. The Alpha moved suddenly, a closing distance between himself and the strategist. You do not decide continuity, he said sharply. The strategist looked at him directly for the first time without deflection. You never did either, he replied. That sentence landed harder than any physical strike could have, because it removed the illusion of authorship from the one person who had always believed himself to be its center. The Omega stepped forward now, her voice quieter but more precise. If this system is correcting imbalance, she said, then what exactly is the imbalance it is correcting? The strategist turned slightly toward her, and for the first time, there was something almost like acknowledgement in his expression, though not empathy. Suppression of return state entities, he said. Kale immediately added, which you represent. The Omega nodded slowly. I'd absorbing that without resistance. And correction means what exactly? She asked. The strategist answered without hesitation. Removal or reintegration of destabilizing nodes. A pause. Depending on compatibility. The Alpha's voice sharpened again. And who defines compatibility? The strategist looked at him briefly. The system already has. That answer made the chamber feel smaller, not physically, but perceptually, as though the space for disagreement had been mathematically reduced. Kale's eyes moved across the chamber again, reading shifts in the containment lattice. It is narrowing outcome pathways, he said quietly. The Omega looked at him. Meaning? Kale's answer came slower now. Meaning fewer possible survival configurations remain. That was when the final escalation began, not through force, but through structural inevitability. The containment units along the far wall began opening in sequence, not releasing anything physical, but projecting streams of encoded data into the central lattice. The Alpha watched this unfold, his expression tightening as recognition of what was being constructed became unavoidable. It is mapping us, he said. Kale nodded. Yes. The strategist added, and resolving optimal correction path. The Omega looked up at the lattice patterns now fully surrounding them. And what is the optimal path? She asked. The strategist turned toward her fully. System stabilization through elimination of divergent source. Silence followed that answer, but it was not empty silence. It was weighted silence, the kind that precedes irreversible decisions. The Alpha spoke more slowly now, as if forcing himself to maintain control over language even if control over outcome was already slipping. "You are calling her the divergent source," he said. The strategist nodded once. "Yes." Kale immediately interjected. "That classification is reductive," he said. The strategist turned slightly toward him. "It is sufficient," he replied. The Omega exhaled slowly, then looked at the Alpha directly. "So this is what it reduces to," she said quietly. "I return and the system decides I should not have." The Alpha did not answer immediately because he was realizing something deeper now, that the system was not reacting to her return as an event. It was reacting to her return as confirmation of an instability that had always been latent. "This is not about you," the Alpha said finally, though the words felt uncertain even as he spoke them. The Omega looked at him for a long moment. "It is entirely about me," she said, "because I am the proof that your hierarchy was never natural." That statement shifted the emotional center of the chamber again. Kyle stepped forward slightly. "The correction system is not emotional," he said. "It is structural." The Omega turned slightly toward him. "Then why does it require elimination instead of adaptation?" Kale did not answer immediately. That hesitation mattered. The strategist answered instead. "Because adaptation requires system redesign," he said. "Elimination requires no redesign." The Alpha finally understood the full brutality of it. "You are not correcting instability," he said quietly. "You are avoiding complexity." The strategist did not deny it. "Efficiency is prioritized over reinterpretation," he replied. That was when the Omega took a step forward into the center of the lattice pattern. Immediately, the projections intensified, focusing entirely on her position. Kale reacted instantly. "Do not move further into center alignment," he warned. But she did not stop. Instead, she looked upward at the surrounding patterns, her voice steady. "If I am the divergent source," she said, "then why am I still standing here?" The strategist's response came immediately. "Because final confirmation is required before resolution." The Alpha moved toward her instinctively, but stopped short of the lattice boundary as it subtly resisted external interference. "Step back," he said to her. The Omega looked at him. "If I step back," she said quietly, "it will still decide the same outcome." The Alpha did not respond because he knew she was right. Kale stepped closer to the strategist now. "There is one unresolved variable," he said. The strategist looked at him. "There is no unresolved variable," he replied. Kale shook his head slightly. "There is," he said. "System awareness of internal contradiction." The Omega looked between them. "Meaning what?" she asked. Kale turned toward her fully now. "Meaning the system is aware that eliminating you does not resolve the structural truth you represent," he said. The chamber reacted subtly to that statement, the lattice flickering for the first time. The strategist's expression tightened slightly. "That is within acceptable recursion margin," he said, but Kale shook his head. "No," he said quietly, "it is not." The Alpha looked at Kale now. "What are you suggesting?" Kale paused, then answered. "That correction cannot proceed without acknowledging source architecture." The Omega's voice softened slightly, almost introspective. "And if it does?" she asked. Kale met her gaze. "Then correction fails as concept," he said. The chamber fell into a deeper silence, and for the first time, the lattice patterns began to destabilize slightly, not collapsing, but losing synchronization. The strategist noticed immediately. "System deviation increasing," he said. The Alpha looked between all of them now, realizing something critical. "This is not a confrontation anymore," he said quietly. Kyle nodded. "No." A pause. "It is interpretation conflict." The Omega looked at the strategist one final time. "Then decide," she said softly. "Is the system meant to preserve truth, or erase what makes truth uncomfortable?" For the first time, the strategist hesitated, and in that hesitation, the lattice stopped advancing. The Alpha stepped forward slowly now, crossing the boundary of hesitation into action. "If the system requires elimination of truth to remain stable," he said quietly, "then it was never stable at all." The Omega looked at him, something softer breaking through the tension between them, not resolution, but recognition. Kale stepped back slightly, as if acknowledging a shift he could no longer define in structural terms. The strategist looked at the lattice, then at the Omega, then finally said something that had not appeared in any protocol sequence. "System cannot resolve contradiction without redefining itself." And for the first time, the chamber did not respond immediately, because systems, when confronted with something they were never designed to interpret, do not always know whether to correct, collapse, or evolve. The Omega finally spoke again, quieter now. "Then let it redefine," she said. And in that moment, the lattice did something it had never done before. It paused. Not ended. Not executed. Paused. The Alpha looked at her, and for the first time since everything began, the conflict between them was no longer dominance or submission, but understanding forming in the space between control and truth. Kale exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. The strategist lowered his hand slightly, no longer executing. And the system, for the first time in its recorded operational cycle, waited. The Omega did not move, neither did anyone else, because in that silence, something fundamental had shifted, not in who held power, but in what power was allowed to mean.